Juniper by Monica Furlong, Chapter 16. The next morning there was a light tap on my door at dawn. Accustomed to early rising, I was already awake. I opened the door quietly so I would not disturb Aerith, and found Gamal waiting outside. "Come out for a ride," he whispered. In a few moments I was dressed. He had 2 horses saddled and ready, and soon we were miles away on a hillside overlooking the sea. We breakfasted out of the wind in a hollow. Gamal had thoughtfully brought bread and some cold meat. "Is it good to be back?" he asked me. I hesitated. "It is lovely to be home, but my father seems ill, and he told me that the harvest was so bad he fears famine." Gamal nodded. He looked miserable, I thought. "Something is very wrong," I added. He was silent, but I felt that there was more he could have said if he had chosen to. Then he mentioned a piece of court news that I had already heard. Marut intended to marry again. "A knight from Caerleon," he said. The name stirred some troubling memory in me, though I could not think of what it was. "She will marry in December," said Gamal shortly. "The king is to give a great feast for her." As we returned home, I noticed a sort of bleakness about the countryside that I did not remember from previous autumns. The sheep looked sickly and listless, the people gray and afraid. Even at Castle Door, now that I was no longer excited to be back, I saw that everyone looked pale, tired, and dispirited. The next day I called upon Marut, as etiquette dictated, to greet her upon my return and to congratulate her upon her marriage. She received me in the little house my father had built for her. She had never ceased complaining about its smallness. And we drank a sweet tawny wine from across the sea and ate honey biscuits. The room was very bare, save for an odd-looking leather stick that stood propped against the wall. Marut wore a gray gown with a turquoise and silver collar. Her wrists were heavy with jewelry of jet and silver. She was accompanied by a huge black hound that I had never seen before, collared like her in turquoise and silver. The hound was so big I could not take my eyes off it. A pastille burned in a dish, giving the room a scent of lilies, yet somewhere beneath that scent there were other smells, sharp and sour and sickening. "So what did Uni teach you?" Marut wished to know. Though it was the same question my father had asked, the way it was asked was quite different. "She taught me healing arts," I said carefully. "She taught me the doses for sicknesses, and the way of touching to make people well. And Angharad of the West taught me to spin and weave." "Angharad," she said in obvious surprise. "Do you know her?" "I did once." The silence fell heavily between us, until Marut left the room to fetch more wine. She closed the door behind her and I glanced around. The leather stick caught my eye again, and I stood up and moved toward it. Immediately the black hound growled softly in its throat and moved between me and the stick. I sat down uneasily. Suddenly I had the oddest feeling that I was being watched, that through a knot in the door or a hole in the tapestry, Marut's cold blue eye was fixed upon me. I composed myself as unself-consciously as possible, and wondered why she would do such a thing. What could she see that she could not observe when she sat in front of me? At that moment the outer door opened, and Gamal came in, hot and weary, wearing parts of his armor and carrying the rest over his arm. He smiled and started telling me of his latest lesson, then sat down, filthy as he was from the practice field. It seemed to me that once again I heard the dog growl softly in its throat, though it did not move. But then Marut came back. The dog slunk into a corner, and Gamal and I fell silent. I was glad when I could go home without appearing rude. My mother was alone that afternoon when I called upon my parents. "It's Marut, isn't it?" I said without delay. "You are afraid she is laying a curse upon Castle Dor." Erlaine nodded. "Your father won't hear of it. He is loyal to her, and it is destroying the kingdom." Erlaine's eyes filled with tears. "I was wondering, Ninook, do you know any magic that might help us?" My first thought was to send for Uni, but then I remembered that she had gone away on a visit to Angharad. I felt both excited and frightened. I had not dreamed that I might need to use my new skills so soon. "Let me think about it," I said. Before I left Erlaine, I gave her a flask of Uni's clear water and told her how to anoint herself with it. "See if you can persuade Father to use it too," I said, not very hopefully. Lying in bed, I thought about the careful schooling I had had in magic, how I had learned all that my wise teacher could tell me. Now I would find out if my education was equal to the challenge. Just as I was falling asleep, I remembered, with a start that woke me right up again, that it was at Caerleon that Truin had encountered a sorcerer and had been saved by Angharad. Who was the sinister enemy of Angharad Truin had once described to me? Suppose, just suppose, it was Marut's new husband. Was this why Marut was startled to hear Angharad's name? If she had not known it before, Marut now knew that Angharad and Uni were friends. Already the plans were going forward for Marut's wedding. Wines were being taken from our cellars. Pigs, chickens, and swans were being fattened. Deer were being hunted. Soon we would start making pies, baking, and roasting. Gifts for the bride from the grey night of Caerleon began to arrive. Silks and spices, scents, and rare fruits. Inlaid boxes containing jewels, nightingales in cages, fine hunting hawks, beautiful ponies with snowy coats and bright enameled harnesses. The knight's presents were so many and frequent that they became the object of jokes around the wooden palace. There was not much to joke about just then, but it was evident that the knight either loved Marut or needed her goodwill. It was clear, too, that he was a rich man. I can still remember the set look on Gamal's face as the knight's servants arrived day after day bearing gifts. "You know, they wish me to go with them to live at Caerleon," he said. "You won't go?" "I don't want to." I knew of Gamal's loyalty to his mother, a loyalty I had only once seen waver. The preparations at Castle Dor speeded up. The bards composed new songs, and the smell of roasting meat pervaded everything. The kingdom was short of food, yet the rules of hospitality demanded that guests should be richly entertained. On the night before the Grey Knight's arrival, my father gave a feast for Marut in the great hall, and she sat beside him in the seat where my mother or I usually sat. Her pale face was flushed, her eyes sparkled, and there was an odd sort of triumph about her that troubled me. Sitting directly opposite her, I could not avoid her gaze, nor the need to make conversation. You will live at the House of the Grey Knight? I asked her. She described it to me, and it sounded very splendid. Yet gazing into her strange light eyes, so lacking in depth or feeling, I felt as I had felt as a small child. Her apparent amiability concealed an intense hatred of me. I remembered my father telling me of Marut's longing as a girl to outstrip him at everything, at running, at shooting with a bow, at climbing trees, or at the civilized arts of singing and oration. For the first time I felt sympathy for Marut. It was hard to be a girl in a royal family and see your younger brother preferred to you for no better reason than that he was a boy. I, who had no brothers, was far luckier than she. I'm sure she thought this. All the same, because I was a girl, I was vulnerable to Marut's scheming. I slept fitfully, tossing and turning, and woke just before the cold gray dawn. I got up quietly and went out, as I had done so often when I was restless or anxious, to walk around the ramparts and the big ditch beyond them. I hailed the sleepy sentries and began a slow pacing. It was bitter cold, and I drew my cloak warmly around me, but I enjoyed watching the light gradually ascending over the valleys. Then, with a sense of shock, I saw the figure of a woman in a field outside, her face turned to the wooden palace. I realized it was Marut. She could not see me. I was no more than a small face above the parapet, and it was still fairly dark. And she went on with what she was doing, moving widdershins, holding up her hand and making signs in the direction of the palace, occasionally dipping her fingers into a bowl she held in her other hand. As the dawn gradually replaced the dark, I saw that her upraised hand was stained a dull red. The bowl must contain blood. I could not hear her voice or see her mouth move, but I had no doubt at all she was uttering spells.